Hello, I'm Bob Hosack, Executive Editor for Baker Academic, and I'm here this morning with Priscilla Pope-Levison, who is the author of a now forthcoming Models of Evangelism book, which is actually releasing October the 27th. But I learned and can tell Priscilla just now that the book just came in to the warehouse today, so you should see a copy in the mail probably by Thursday. So
okay,
myself as
I'll
well.
Look forward to it.
That'll be fun. And Priscilla is Associate Dean for External Programs and Professor of Ministerial Studies at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University, and has extensive experience in this world of evangelism area, and we'll be talking about that in a few minutes. I'm just going to give a quick capsule of what the book is about and then turn to her with some questions. So the background is many believers, many Christians simply dismiss evangelism or they create stereotypes, caricatures that aren't really accurate. The aim of this book is to help readers to get beyond those types of false impressions and to consider both theologically and practically how they can engage in evangelism. The book is at once biblical, theological, historical, and practical. So all these elements are involved. And so it covers a breadth of approaches, and we'll get into what all those are soon enough, and taking a deeper look at evangelism and discover the model that the goal is that would best work for the reader. Right. Each chapter introduces and assesses a model biblically, theologically, as I said, historically, and practically, and allows for comparison sort of across the spectrum. So, all right, that's my little promo. Now we'll get to some questions from the author. All right, I want to start with a personal question, since I would guess that most people who are in a church are a believer would call themselves a Christian, no matter what tradition or denomination or group they're a part of, somehow came to faith through some combination of the models that you cite here in the book. So I would just like to begin with, so how is it that you became a Christian? What was your experience?
First, Bob, let me say that it's a joy to have this conversation with you, and thank you again for your role in shepherding this book to its completion. So
sure.
So I was raised in a United Methodist Church. I was actually baptized in the high school gym because they were building, this was 1958, height of the baby boomer, and they were building the bigger building as I was born. The church that I grew up in was actually founded in 1830. So it's an old church, and the old chapel is still across the street, but they were building the new sanctuary. So I was baptized in the high school gym, and we were in church every Sunday, and I was involved. One of the best parts of growing up in the church was every summer we went to, I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the Appalachian region. We would do a mission trip our youth group every summer. That's actually sparked my interest in liberation theology, believe it or not. But that's a topic story for another book that I've written before. So then I went on to a United Methodist college, DePaul University, and then on to seminary. But actually, it was really personal evangelism that sparked my passion for my faith and introduced me to a more personal relationship with God. And that was my best friend from high school, who happened to be the district superintendent's daughter in the Cincinnati district. I went to visit her at her campus, which happened to be Vanderbilt. And I met some, what I now know were what we would probably call evangelical Christians who kept talking about this personal relationship with God. And I wanted to know more about that. So that really sparked my interest. And at one point when I was a junior at DePauw University, I got down on my knees and said, God, I want to, I believe in you and let's do this. That's not exactly how I said it.
The sinner's prayer, as it's called in some.
Yeah, my own version.
Yes.
But then the next day, I actually received my call to ministry. And at that point, I had never seen a woman preach. And that I was a music major, and that put me on a whole new direction. And within 2 years, I was enrolled in seminary. So it's a church, and the Christian faith has always been a part of my life.
Sure. Okay. No, I can relate. I will say I grew up in a nominal Christian home. At least was familiar with I'll say basics of the faith.
Right.
But
it
was through personal evangelism. A relative of mine inviting me to a Bible study, and you have all these concepts kind of working together, and suddenly what I heard one night there, I had never heard in the prior 18 years of my life. So however that works, I think it's called the Holy Spirit.
Well, and in terms of models, what I grew up with, I think, was more of a liturgical evangelism, though not, it could have been much more focused on evangelism and presenting the gospel. But I was raised in the church, understood churchy language, seasons of the church year, and then it was, as you said, a personal conversation that really caused me to want to know more and to commit my life.
Great. On that for going further down the road with that, I know you've taught evangelism classes in local church settings and at a variety of schools, seminaries and such. Can you share a little bit about where you've taught these classes, and further, what prompted you, after many years of teaching, working in this field, to finally write a book about evangelism?
Well, I could say it's my old age. So I'm looking towards the end of my career, my vocation, and it was also timing. I finished a big project on women evangelists in the progressive era, turn of the 20th century. I've always been writing about evangelism. So my dissertation was on Latin American liberation theology and evangelism, and that was published in early 90s. So, and then I've published several books on the history of women evangelists. I've written a lot of articles on that. And so I've been writing on evangelism, coming at it from sort of different vantage points, but I've always taught the models of evangelism as the core of my introductory course in evangelism. In fact, that was a student project. Every student chose a model, and they looked at it biblically, theologically, historically, and practically. So in many ways, it was the richness over several decades of teaching, of listening to student presentations, and then every intro class, the final assignment was to design a 1-year evangelism strategy for their ministry setting. And they were to incorporate at least one, but preferably a range of models that they felt were particularly applicable for where they were. So I guess, it's many years invested in this. And to be honest, Bob, students really appreciated the models. They just felt like that helped them get a handle on evangelism and how they, as church leaders, might be able to incorporate it in practical and strategic ways. So timing, but also wanting to capture what they found to be so helpful.
Okay. Yeah, I had another question I was going to ask you. I think you just answered that in terms of, it's interesting to hear the background. This book certainly has been field tested, because I wasn't aware that you had taught using the models for such a long time and had this interaction with students and things. So to our benefit, we're positioning and promoting this book as a textbook for use in evangelism classes. So it sounds very fit for that very topic. And the takeaway would be, as you said, exposure to all of these models, and students come pastors, church leaders, learning, oh, this is what's the best fit for me personally, or my ministry group or my congregation.
Since Baker sent out the email about the book, I heard from someone I've known for a long time who's designing a theology of evangelism class. And he recognized that I've kind of incorporated Avery Dulles' Models of the Church as the prototype in a way. And he said that this book is going to fit beautifully in his class, because of course I do theology in every chapter. So, I mean, that's been one of the fun parts of this. I've always been interdisciplinary in my work. I'm an historian and a theologian, and of course I'm married to a biblical scholar. My spouse, Jack Levison, who's also a two-time author with Baker, vetted all of my biblical work. So if there's a mistake, you can blame him, not me. But it does help in that regard, because when you're teaching undergraduates or seminary students, it's hard to be myopic in your focus. And so this really, the breadth of, I think, each chapter lends itself to being used in a variety of classroom settings.
All right. You just mentioned your husband, Jack, who I interviewed last week for one of his new books. And at some point we tried to hold up the book. And
I love the cover. The cover is the best.
So this is the cover of the book, which we will have in our hands later this week. And the cover is so great that it graces the cover of our new academic catalog. So anyway, we're happy about that. And that's just a little commercial break there.
Thank you.
I'm going to read from something that was in your book that I think is to me raises an interesting question. And this has to do with a recent Barna study where you mention it's quoted, a startling 6 in 10, Americans believe that any attempt to convert others to one's own faith is extreme. More than 8 out of 10 nuns say so. To be clear, a majority of U.S. adults and the vast majority of non-religious adults, 83%, believe that evangelism is religiously extreme. So I'm just curious, how did we get to this point? What shifts in the church and culture brought us to where we are? And is there a future for evangelism?
Let me start with that second question. And I would say, absolutely, there's a future. I wouldn't have spent several years and much of my teaching in evangelism if I didn't believe there was a future for it. And to be honest, in a way, I think the context right now is even more fertile for evangelism, because in a way we're not, it's not sort of a zero-sum game, but any attempt with, and we'll talk about the characteristics that I believe evangelism should be practiced with. Any attempt for Christians to be hospitable, to have integrity, to build relationships and those kind of things will go so far, because there is such a polarization. Even before this political cycle, there's such polarization, and people speak with stridency and don't want to, in a sense, hear what other people are saying in anger. But I think it's nothing new in a way that the church has been labeled as full of hypocrisy. I mean, I would love to say that it's because of televangelists in the 1980s when so many fell from grace. But then you think about Sinclair Lewis writing Elmer Gantry in the 1920s. And so, there's revivalists I teach my students that revivalism is quintessentially American, because that's how so much of the church, particularly Methodists and Baptists in the 19th century, crossed the frontier. And, by virtue of wanting people to come to decision now and not put it off for tomorrow, there's that sense of we can't take time, we can't speak with humility, we have to come with, we have the answer. And I think that shaped a lot of American evangelism. And I have a chapter on revival in the book. I think there are ways to do any model that can be beneficial and can be a positive. But I think that shaping with revivalism has sort of come around and bit us in the foot, or whatever that expression is.
Yes.
And I think it's only gotten worse. I mean, it's only gotten worse with the stridency in, political and social life. But absolutely, there's a future for evangelism if the church can capture this moment and come with humility, come with integrity, and lead with that, and say, we don't have all the answers, but we do have good news. Yeah. Let's talk about that good news.
All right. So the first part of that question was, I guess, would take a longer answer, but we don't need to go into all this. But what I ask about the shifts in church or culture, why is there this suspicion? You said a few things there, but can you tease that out a bit more?
Well, I think I gave some generic, some basic responses, general responses. But I think with that, Christians have really shied away from, we don't want to impose, we don't want to come with what we have all the answers. And what I'm saying is, I wouldn't want you to come that way either, that there are ways to approach this ancient Christian practice, nothing new, this ancient Christian practice in ways that will almost disarm people. And that's what I'm calling people to in this book.
And pardon me for not hearing the answer that you gave to my dual.
Well, I started with is there a future?
Right.
And because I want to emphasize absolutely.
Yeah, but you're talking about the political and social context. I think that's a good catchphrase to help us to understand. This is why certain, perhaps particularly younger Christians are adverse or nervous about this, and we're just in a different era than that of the revivalist era from the 19th century. So, but that's very helpful. Thank you. To follow up on that, I'm going to read again a passage of scripture in this case, and this is Eugene Peterson's paraphrase of Romans 10:14. But how can people call for help if they don't know who to trust? And how can they know who to trust if they haven't heard of the one who can be trusted? And how can they hear if nobody tells them? This strikes me as a biblical mandate for evangelism, certainly at least one of them. But besides the words of scripture, which we can find in a couple of different places, how can you convince 21st century believers of the importance of this practice?
I think one way, and perhaps the most winsome way, is to ask them to recall what it was that was most formative in their life when they either started going to church or became a Christian, or however it is you want to say that expression. And actually, I just 2 weeks ago found out that I was the recipient, a colleague and I, of $1 million grant from Lilly Endowment to work on, thank you, to work on testimony as community engagement. And I think that, and this actually emerged from this time in COVID-19, where I saw all kinds of churches returning to the practice of testimony. Where is God at work in your life, and tell me about it? And so it strikes me that helping people articulate how it was, what it was that helped, that influenced them when they first came to faith, and asking them to return to that and think about it, I think is a good way of helping people catch that passion. I mean, it's very true that when people first make any kind of commitment, there's an initial excitement, there's an initial enthusiasm. The Salvation Army and other evangelical groups used to have people newly converted stand up on a soapbox and tell their testimony, because in the throes of that initial fervor, they were, in a sense, most enthusiastic. And so I think part of it is helping people get back to what that was, and using that as a motivator in a way, or just recalling them to the fact. And I think the second thing is that we are good news people. That's who we are as Christians. That's our DNA. And one of my favorite passages, and actually it's the passage that I work with a lot, particularly in the introduction of the book, is Isaiah 52:7, where it says, "How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace and brings good news." That's who we are. And I think that recalling some of that initial enthusiasm, but also helping people see that we have good news. It's not, we don't go out with all the answers, but we do have a gospel, a euangelion, and that's the root of evangelism, of what we proclaim. And then I think lastly, what the book does, I hope, is to convince them that it can be done, that they have a place where they can fit in this practice of evangelism.
Okay, no, that's good. I wanted to ask you now, and I don't see now where I had it. Maybe I didn't list it as a question. You have 8 models that you just use in the book. Can you just, in the briefest way, just tell us what those are, just to give an overview of, so help us to understand what all encompasses evangelism in Scripture and
so
pastoral life.
As Jack or my close friends, my kids will tell you, I'm very organized. So the book is organized within each chapter, and then the chapters are organized from the most intimate, personal evangelism all the way to global and to media evangelism. That's the 8th chapter. So it starts with personal, and then I tried kind of to imagine that circle of impact, in a sense, growing larger and larger. So it starts with personal evangelism, also called individual lifestyle evangelism.
Right.
Moves on to small group evangelism, and I tried in each chapter to encapsulate what it is so that people aren't guessing. So small group evangelism is exactly what it is. It's a group dedicated specifically for evangelism. The next one is visitation. And that's what it is. It is the church getting outside of its walls and moving into the neighborhood, its community, its city, with this good news. I also add a service component to that, which I see in some of the literature, which I think kind of brings it into the modern era.
Sure.
And then there's liturgical evangelism, which again is it's really built on Hippolytus's apostolic tradition and the seasons of the church year. Right. And then church growth, which is growing the churches by planting new churches, new ports of entry, and then prophetic, which I think will have a resonance with a lot of people who might be disaffected from the church, because that is looking more structurally, politically, economically, socially, and the integration of word and deed.
Sure.
And I rely a lot on John Perkins in that chapter.
Okay. Yep. Great. And
then revival, we've talked about, and then media. Media was the hardest one for me because I am not a social media person at all. So I had to do a ton of research on that. I had several people reading that chapter who are much more versed with this concept than I was. But I actually found it really fascinating because in my work as an historian, I've done a lot on the technology that evangelism relies on, whether it's automotive or it's radio, television, all of that. And so I was able, I think, to bring some interesting historical perspective to this. So those are the 8 models.
Okay, no, that's helpful. I found where I had that question, and there was something else I was going to ask, which I think is worth asking. It's a little out of order here, but pardon me. I'm sure you can tackle it. In Scripture, there are a number of places where spiritual gifts are listed, and evangelism specifically is listed there in Ephesians. What's to keep someone from saying, I don't have the gift of evangelism, I don't need to do anything? How does that, it being a spiritual gift, how does that comport with your argument and you're trying to make a case that we should all be doing some kind of evangelism?
Well, first of all, I do think there are people who are tremendously gifted with evangelism. My mother-in-law was one. She sold Avon products. She brought people to Christ. She was in a bowling league. She brought people to Christ. And Jack has a sort of a lot of that natural fervor, that spirit. But just as we say, there are people who are teachers, that doesn't mean that we don't teach in our church, or it doesn't mean we don't teach our kids, or, there is that sort of more generic sense of these gifts. Also, that's only one list of spiritual gifts.
Right.
You have the gift of faith, and that's mentioned as a spiritual gift, but we wouldn't say, well, that's only for some people. So I think absolutely there are people who are called to evangelism, and I think the church should do everything it possibly can to support them and come alongside them. But we're talking about, like John 1, again and again, the disciples say, come and see, come and see. There is just so many examples of everyday people of faith all through the book of Acts. Peter certainly had his big crowds, but then, you have Lydia and you have, Priscilla and Aquila. Just people who are captured by this good news and want and feel this compulsion. And I would say that, again, that's part of who we are as Christian believers. We are good news people. And I think the more we live into that and it becomes a natural part of who we are, the more, and the other thing I would say is you can look at all these models, but the most effective is one person talking with another person about faith. One of the most famous definitions of evangelism is D.T. Niles, who from Sri Lanka, former early ecumenical leader, who said evangelism is one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. That is the most effective. The statistics are like 85, 90 some percent of people who've become a Christian because of one other person. And, that's easily done in our everyday conversations, in our everyday texts, in our everyday emails. And I think sometimes it's a cop-out to say, I don't have that gift. I'm not an apostle. I'm not a teacher. I'm not an evangelist. And I don't buy it.
Now, I remember as a young Christian hearing that Niles quote, and it really resonated with me because that's what I just was. I was a beggar. I still am a beggar. Yeah. So to tell someone else where to find bread, that's a beautiful image.
Yeah, you come with humility. You come with not a power over. There's often a power dynamic in evangelism. This is just one person having found good news, sharing it with another person. And it's a brilliant metaphor that I think is timeless because it's so true.
Right. And in that sense, you mentioned, in Scripture, in the book of Acts, examples of individuals sharing their faith and such. So that one-on-one personal lifestyle, whatever we want to call it, evangelism, that's existed since the early church. But
Oh,
some of the other models are newer, can we say that? Just
Yeah.
because of the development of church history and later on technology, whatever. I don't. Do you have any thoughts about that? Like what's more relevant today? Is there a model that's more relevant to the 21st century?
I think so. I think, as I said, I think media evangelism, if it's carefully done, and as I present in the book, doing it within a group. And another one of your authors who wrote the book, Always On, I leaned on her book.
Angela Grell. Yes.
Yeah, I leaned on her book a lot, and we've corresponded because
good.
she has she sets social media in the context of a worshiping community that prays together, that talks about ethics together. And so it's not just lone rangers, tweeting this or that, but it's embedded in the community. And so I think media evangelism responsibly done, again, with integrity, building relationships. It's not one that I'm terribly familiar with at all.
Yeah.
But I think someone can read that chapter and know how to proceed. I do think, as I mentioned, I do think prophetic evangelism, it's one where I have more resonance. I brought in some of my early work on liberation theology. I think that goes a long way for when people criticize that Christians are all talk and no action, or there's non-integrity between what they say and what they do. That Christians aren't willing to sort of put their martyria, their testimony that's bodily on the line. I think that goes a long way. And as I said, I relied on John Perkins, on Orlando Costas, even Charles Finney, who in the 19th century, said that reform isn't going to happen if churches don't have the right stance on human rights. And of course, at that point, he was talking about slavery. Yes. Well, I think that has tremendous resonance in our context today. So I would say that media evangelism and prophetic, and I also, as I mentioned, try to recapture visitation evangelism for a more modern era, because I think that a lot of us have become more insular. So as I write in the book, we live in Dallas, we live in a townhome, and with 11 other townhomes, we pull in our garage, we close the garage door, we go upstairs, and we've lived there for 5 years and only know a few of our neighbors. And I think we've become more insular, the church has, and this could be a brilliant way to encourage the church to move out. Yeah. So yeah, those are just a couple ideas.
Yeah, no, I think those are excellent illustrations of even my earlier question about cultural changes, just the way we live and the homes we inhabit, and
right.
It just changes things in innumerable ways. I have a final. It's kind of a big question in the sense that once again I'm going to read something. And in this case, I'm going to read a endorsement that is on the back cover of your book. And this is from noted theologian and author Walter Brueggemann. And he compliments you for a comprehensive taxonomy. That's the 8 models we've been discussing. And he says, the familiar faces of evangelism are hot, coercive mantras and cool, manipulative marketing. Priscilla Pope-Levison will have none of that. Instead, she provides a rich, comprehensive taxonomy of the various spheres of evangelism, each of which reaches out in hospitable ways to different populations. This book will be, for a long while, the state-of-the-art articulation on this urgent subject. It is a welcome articulation. We can only hope that will be true, that his endorsement will be a prophetic endorsement.
He who wrote Prophetic Imagination.
Yeah, exactly. But when I read about his comment about different populations, I immediately thought about okay, just within Protestantism, we'll limit that. There are evangelical, you mentioned earlier, groups, and then more traditional mainline approaches. So if we're spanning the American Protestantism today, can you explain why or how some of these, you can just choose a couple models, would be more naturally practiced in evangelical churches or liturgical churches, mainline, whatever?
Yeah, happy to. Though I do want to start with the fact that I was able, in the course of my working on the book, we were in Germany and traveled to Rome.
Right.
And I was able to interview Pope Francis's Twitter and Instagram, the person who handles those for him. And it was delightful, because I know we're talking about Protestantism, but the Roman Catholic Church has had a long commitment to integrating media and other forms of evangelism. So that was just fun. But yes, I mean, we all come to a project with our particular theological lens. However, when I would begin to research a model, I purposefully looked widely across the theological spectrum. So I think some people who know the theological world might be surprised at some of the, just within each chapter, the range of people that I work with, and then across the book, you know, the range is even wider. But certainly, when you think about liturgical evangelism, it is going to more naturally fit with high church traditions. I mean, it was coined by Robert Weber, who was, you know, longtime professor at Wheaton College, who became an Anglican Episcopalian at that point. And however, I think, you know, I've worshiped in a lot of non-denominational churches, and I think their fervor for the preached word could be blended beautifully with a liturgical tradition, a liturgical setting. I mean, they're very liturgical in the fact that they follow the same pattern every Sunday. However, that's not integrated into the larger Christian liturgy of the church year. And I think they who are often more evangelistic could really benefit from that balance. But certainly liturgical evangelism would fit a more high church tradition. I mean, we've talked about revival being more of a what we might consider evangelical tradition, church growth, which came out of, you know, was rooted at Fuller for a long time. But all churches can benefit from thinking about new ports of entry. You know, that
I like that.
Every group becomes stale after a while. And how do you invite people? You don't invite, it's like the old wine and new wineskins. You don't expect people to come into a group and that's already been meeting, in a sense. But I think, again, prophetic, I think will resonate with a lot of younger church members. I mean, I think about Shane Claiborne, who was so influenced by John Perkins, and that desire to merge evangelism and social justice. That's really what that chapter is getting at. So that's a sort of a brief gloss on, I think, some of the ways that some models might fit into
I think,
different groups.
And you've said this a couple of times now, but I think it really does bear repeating, the attraction of the prophetic in today's context, where there's so much conversation about justice, social action. I mean, one can't escape it if they're at all dialed into the daily news cycle. So how does the church respond to that context? And you're saying and you're writing about this is how we can do it, and perhaps even more so need to be alert to the possibilities because of American society today. So well, thank you very much. It was delightful to spend this time with you this morning, and we will hope that our many viewers out there benefit from this, and will buy that book, because by the time this goes live, it will be available. October 27th. So
Thank you,
thanks,
Bob.
Priscilla.
Great
All
to
right.
talk with you.
Yep. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.